Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Reisman, and I am co-chair of the CGCC Government and Public Relations Committee. I'm also Managing Director and Chief Communications Officer at Bank of China, USA. Today, I am your host for this conversation about U.S. China relations post-presidential election. On behalf of CGCC, I'd like to express my warmest welcome and appreciation to everyone attending today's webinar. Founded in 2005, the China General Chamber of Commerce has been recognized as the largest and most influential nonprofit organization representing Chinese businesses in the United States. It is an independent, private, nonpartisan, non-governmental chamber of commerce whose work is made possible through the generous support of its member companies and corporate sponsors, both from the U.S. and from China. Our last U.S. China relations discussion before the election was a huge success. There were many requests for more rounds of candid conversations and diverse viewpoints. So here we are today. We are excited to welcome back some of our old friends, many of them who you have met at our previous events, and some new ones as well. We have with us Ambassador Max Baucus. He is a former U.S. Senator from Montana and the former U.S. Ambassador to China. With us as well is Brian Lanza. He is a partner in Mercury's Washington, D.C. office. He served as communications director for President Trump's transition team in 2016. You probably recall having met both Ambassador Baucus and Brian at our last Path Forward webinar back in September. We also have with us today Michael Borden. He is a partner at Sidley Austin and leads the government strategies group at the firm. He worked for a decade on Capitol Hill and recently shared his thoughts on sanctions and export controls at CGCC's Legal Policy Series webinar. Unfortunately, as it was originally advertised, we were also supposed to have with us Gerardo Mato from HSBC. Due to personal medical matter, he could not join us today, but we certainly wish him well. Some housekeeping rules, or some final housekeeping rules. Today's event is closed to the media, open to CGCC USA and its chapter's board members only. While today's comments are on the record, the opinions expressed, including those of the moderator and speakers, do not necessarily represent the institutions we all work for. If you do have any questions during the course of the webinar, you are welcome to bring them up in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. Our speakers will try their best to address them during the Q&A session at the end. We have allocated an hour and a half for this session, so I believe we should have plenty of time to address all of those questions. So allow me to briefly set, and I will be brief today, to set the backdrop for the following questions and discussion. Gentlemen, we are now more than 2 years into one of the fiercest trade wars in our lifetime. This has caused instability in the markets, uncertainty for both U.S. and Chinese companies in both countries, and tremendous losses and lost opportunities for businesses and consumers due to the trade war and COVID-19. Today, we are exactly 1 week after one of the most intense and consequential elections of our lifetime. While the results of the elections are pending certification, it appears that former Vice President Biden will be the next President of the United States. A statement by Vice Foreign Minister Luo Yucheng said last Thursday that China hopes the next U.S. President and his new government will meet China halfway on many of the differences that they have. I will ask this question to each of our panelists and start with Ambassador Baucus.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So, Ambassador Baucus, what do the results mean for the U.S. and what do they mean for China?
Well, I think it's positive. Maybe not so positive short term, because I think it's basically status quo short term, but I think it's a positive midterm and long term, so long as both sides exercise good faith and pursue a solution of mutual self-respect. That is, where the United States respects China, does not want to in any way indicate it's trying to stop China's rise. At the same time, where China respects the United States, where Americans realize that, where China realizes they can't push the United States around, they can't bully the United States, they can't play the United States like it has in the past. It takes two to tango. And in this case, it takes both the United States and China to work this out. Now, the United States is still the largest country. This big change with the election. I think worldwide, at least among Western allies, there's a great sigh of relief that Biden got elected, because world leaders, especially Western countries, know that Biden is a president they can, quote, work with. That is, Biden will not use his Twitter account. Biden will be predictable, and Biden's word is his bond, and he is someone who wants to work with people rather than not work with people, rather than just kind of bully. And as I think President Trump has done it in some cases. Now, we have real deep concerns here. Obviously, one, frankly, doesn't directly answer your question, but that's internally in the United States. I think Biden's won the election, but on the other hand, the Trump people haven't conceded, stirring things up here, and that internal confusion is not helpful. It's not helpful to America. America's governing, and it's not helpful because other countries, in this case China, see that confusion, and it kind of causes China on the margin to feel that maybe Americans are perhaps declining more quickly than they had thought. It's a problem, and it also very much depends on Georgia. If the Senate is Republican after Georgia, that is the Senate, one or two Senate seats in Georgia go Republican, then that means Biden's going to be facing probably even more division than he otherwise would. So and that I say that because there are many senators, a few senators, Republicans, who are quite vocal in their criticism of China. Republican senators are quite vocal, not just Republicans. To be honest, Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democratic Party, is pretty vocal in his criticism of China too.
That seems to be a pretty bipartisan issue these days in the Congress and Senate.
But it's going to be worse. It's going to be even more divisive, in my judgment, with Republican Senate, because some of the Republican senators will be unleashed. And add to that, we're already facing midterm elections. Elections are already on. People are raising money for 2022. We already have presidential elections. I was in a webinar yesterday with somebody who I'm quite confident is going to be running for president in 2024. So it's internal politics in the United States make things
Republican
difficult.
or Democrat?
Just somebody running. And it's so I'll go back what I said. Basically status quo, not much is going to change short term. Biden's not going to rescind any of those sanctions that Trump has enacted with respect to Hong Kong or Xinjiang or whatnot. That's not going to happen. But Biden, after a while, will try to reset the relationship in a way where he's not perceived as a pushover. He's not going to be perceived as being able to be played by China, but one is going to try. It's going to be difficult to try to get respect of the Chinese, so they respect America.
So Brian, I know you have an opposing view to this, or maybe not completely opposing view.
I don't think Brian will be that opposed. On the margin, not totally.
We'll see what he's holding out for until January 20th. But
Right.
Brian, what are your thoughts on where we are today?
Ambassadorship at the last minute. I think Ambassador Baucus is right in saying that not a lot of things are going to change. It's going to be very much status quo. I think the most dangerous part of the relationship is probably the next 11 weeks, when you have a President Trump unleashed. Now that we no longer have, a defense secretary, we have an acting defense secretary. And that's sort of, the directives I hear that are coming inside the administration, is very similar to like, hey, whoever has been a target, let's see what more we can ramp up on those companies and individuals, and let's see what else is on the table, in the next 11 weeks, knowing full well that Joe Biden wouldn't be inclined to undo some of those policies. As for Joe Biden,
but before we get to the transition period, which I do want to talk about, overall, what do you think? You're very much in the know, I'm sure, in both campaigns. So what does it really mean at the end of the day, as far as the overall approach between what the last administration did or what the next administration will do?
I think the biggest thing you'll see is a change in tone, sort of less confrontation. But you'll definitely see a significant change in tone. I mean, keep in mind, President Trump with his China policy, he negotiated still, a phase one. He wanted that to be completed. He thought the relationship was imbalanced. So the ambassador is right that Biden, President-elect Biden needs to calibrate how he deals with China so that it doesn't look to be a pushover. I mean, that was his relationship with China for the last 30 years was that of a pushover, basically. So he needs to reverse, the perception that the Chinese already have of him. And so he's not going to sort of take the exact opposite approach to everything President Trump's doing. My guess is, he's going to be more measured, more calculated. But the other thing that the senator points out, or the ambassador points out really well, is, if it's a Republican Senate, even with this Republican Senate, we've seen them influence this administration policy to go more into the hawk phase of things than before. They're only going to be more emboldened to do that during a Republican Senate and a Democratic presidency. And you'll still have the Rubios, the Cottons. You'll still have those Menendez, even Schumer be active. It is bipartisan, the criticism of China. But I think you'll see, if Trump ultimately loses and the Republicans hold on to the Senate, the Republicans will be the tip of the spear with the China policy, which is even more aggressive than what President Trump wanted to do. I mean, President Trump, ultimately when he started the presidential campaign, he said that the trade was imbalanced. He didn't have these national security concerns that the hawks in Congress had. He ultimately adopted them, but his ultimate thing was, hey, trade's imbalanced. We got to fix the imbalance. That was how he won. That was it. And NAFTA was bad. He wasn't talking about national security concerns. And I think as he leaves, he can leave some national security sort of time bombs for the Biden administration that they'd have to handle on an appropriate timeline. But the policies is not going to be much different, but there will be a tone difference. But also, I think the Republican Senate will be unleashed on the Democratic presidency to just drag them to Congress, make strong recommendations, threaten no more confirmations. I mean, we're going to see an unleashed Republican Senate dealing with China with the Democratic presidency.
Michael, you've got 10 years on Capitol Hill and a lot of experience now on the deal side. What does the election mean right now, both to the Chinese and to the United States?
Well, I think actually what both Mr. Bacchus and Brian just said, there's a lot of truth to a lot of what each of them said. There is an expectation, I think, from many outside observers that there's going to be a significant change in U.S. policy because Joe Biden is so different than Donald Trump. But the reality is there is a bipartisan consensus in Congress and frankly around the country that it's important for the United States to be quote unquote tough on China. And it's just, if you look in just the last year at legislation that's passed the Congress, whether it's been one house or the other, or enacted, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, the Hong Kong Policy Act, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, 4 bills, all very significant, all which target China directly. And collectively, together, I think those 4 bills had a total of 4 negative votes, 4 no's in the Congress. So it's not as if the Republicans are tough on China and the Democrats are weak, or the Republicans are tough on China and the Republicans are weak. They're all, frankly, taking a very hard line and seeking to punish China for different policies that they've taken internally, whether it's with regard to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, whether it's regard to Hong Kong, or other concerns that they've had about trade or other policies in the United States. So I don't think you're going to see a really significant change in policy in the next 6 months to a year. I think it's just also important, and Brian referenced it, is to watch and monitor very closely these next 11 weeks. Because what we've seen, what we're already seeing in the beginning of this transition is chaos. The Secretary of Defense was fired yesterday. Today, just a few minutes ago, the acting Undersecretary of the Department of Defense for Policy resigned. And what is that going to mean with a lot of potential punitive Chinese executive orders and punitive actions against China looming? It means that it means that we are entering a really unpredictable time. And for many companies, they're looking at I'm thinking of right now the 31 companies that are on the Department of Defense list for their affiliation with the Communist Chinese military. I think that this is a particularly risky time because between now and January 20th, there's a lot that the president can do without Congress. And so there's a lot to be aware of, and there's a lot to be very concerned about.
So Brian, that's a good leadway into this segment here, where you know President Trump probably better than anybody else here on this panel, of course. You've worked with him closely. How do you see the transition? Again, let's leave the lawsuits aside, and whether or not there's any possibility of a change in the final certification process. But how do you see, assuming that he will not take office on January 20th, how do you see the next 2 months playing out during the transition period? Is he going to make things harder on China and harder for Biden to unravel, or is there going to be a different approach?
No, I think you're going to see him be harder on China. Just his instinct. He's no longer has the sort of the leash of a phase 2 deal that he can negotiate. You have to remember his policies and his criticism for China. They're not a new Republican issue. I mean, when he was a Democrat most of his life, he still had these same criticism with trade. And he still feels that a lot of these communities, whether in Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Wisconsin, were gutted as a result of these trade deals. And now he has merged, those economic fears about China, with these national security fears about China. And he's learned, through the last 4 years, that the national security threat actually carries more weight in Washington, D.C. and he has more executive authority over that, as opposed to dealing with the trade agreements. And so I think you're going to see him be more aggressive. I've already talked to some of his staff in the National Security Council's office. They're busy. They've made that point abundantly clear that they're going to be speeding to the very end. They've been told not to start looking for jobs, that they're expected that they need to stay till the very end because their work's so critical towards the continuity of government. As for Trump himself, the transition, working with the Biden administration, I think it's going to be tough. There's laws that sort of say that certain things need to happen. I think that ultimately will occur, but I don't think it will be a smooth transition because there's just still a lot of maybe hurt feelings or old wounds from our transition when we tried to go forward and we were sort of tagged with this fake Russia collusion stuff by the Clinton campaign and sort of caused us to trip during that transition period. I think that still leaves a little soreness with President Trump, and he's not the type of person that wouldn't mind seeing Joe Biden trip during his transition. So I think we're 11 weeks is going to be a tough 11 weeks.
So Ambassador, from the Biden camp, if you will, they've got, again, assuming that the election results stay as is, they've got a tough transition ahead of them. I'm sure you've been tapped for maybe some guidance or some advice in various areas, but how do you see the transition playing out, and what, if anything, the Biden camp can do, or nothing?
Well, far be it from me to slightly question Brian, but I might ask Brian to maybe reassess.
We like that. It's okay. Brian doesn't mind.
Maybe reassess his assessment. Trump was tough on China for a lot of reasons. One, he believed it, but second, helped him get elected. Now he's in a different phase. He doesn't need China to get elected. He needs the courts. he needs the judicial process. He doesn't need China. China's irrelevant right now with respect to whether Trump could figure out some way to pull a rabbit out of the hat here. So I'm not sure. In fact, I'd be surprised if he does anything really significant with respect to China, because his focus now is on himself, on trying to be president. That's the judicial process. It's all these states he's working with and this and that. Doesn't have very much to do with China. Going back to your question, Peter, it's essentially the difference. I mean, back up a little bit. These tariffs that were imposed on China, frankly, didn't cause China's behavior to change very much. China did not open up that much more. China, did not reduce its subsidies. The technology transfer, as I can tell, pretty much continues. Forced technology transfer pretty much tends. There's not a lot of change. And what's happened? What's happened is it's caused China to impose tariffs. And boy, Iowa soybean farmers sure know that. Hog producers know that. Sure, now they get big payments from USDA to make up the difference, but that's not the way to run a railroad. And add to that, the deficit is not down. The trade deficit's gone up, and that's forgotten by a lot of people. And so it basically didn't really work. But we're stuck. We've got these tariffs, both sides. Phase one kind of working, not really, because of COVID. It's hard for China to perform up to under the terms of phase one. But I think essentially Biden will not do much with respect to China for a while. Rather, he's going to focus on the U.S. and the U.S. economy. He's going to focus first on COVID. He already has his COVID task force. He's already talking about everybody should be wearing a mask. And he also is coming out very strong at first. I wouldn't be surprised if he names a chief of staff pretty soon, or even some of the top potential cabinet fairly soon, an NSA, an security advisor fairly. I don't know. He's coming out strong and quick, but the focus is domestic and infrastructure and so forth, because he believes two reasons he's doing that. One, that country could project more foreign policy strength, the more we're stronger internally, economically at home, with infrastructure, so forth. He also is on the edge. Now, the Republican Senate may kind of throw a wrench in all this, trying to address climate change through the infrastructure bill, trying to get new renewable energy technologies that's going. So that's a major focus because he cares so much about climate. And so you're not going to see much of a change, not I don't think, addressing China for a while yet. And in a certain sense, kind of getting to sea legs with respect to China. What's that, trying to figure it out?
You said here, and you said in the past, Ambassador Baucus, that basically a Biden administration is going to be as tough on China. And he's not going to roll back any sanctions or export controls. Specifically, you mentioned holding China accountable and U.S. becoming more self-sufficient. Could you further dive into that and what that really means, and especially, what do you think it means for supply chains, for businesses, for cooperation? I think you're certainly in the camp that believes in more China engagement, but how does that really then happen under a Biden administration?
Well, you've asked several questions. They're all good questions. One about supply chains, and I think there's no question there's going to be more reshoring. Now it's kind of fluid. My guess is a lot of businessmen are going to kind of wait and see what Biden is or is not going to do. Is he going to make the relationship even more toxic than it has been, or maybe try to back off? Then what next question is, how does China react, or what initiative does China take in this regard? I think it's still pretty fluid. Nevertheless, I do think there'll be a significant reshoring, not or back to the U.S., perhaps other countries, perhaps, but certainly more self-sufficiency in a lot of technologies and a lot of industries that are under the rubric of national security. COVID has caused some of this, clearly. I think there's no question in my mind that's going to be a large part of it. But bottom line, I've said this before, China's not going anywhere. China's always going to be there. It's a big country. The United States has to deal with it. It's a fact of life. You have to deal with it. And it's better that we try to deal with it, if we can, constructively than not. Then we're better off. Then it's not a zero-sum game. In the past, unfortunately, it's been perceived a bit of a zero-sum game. Don't forget, there's a big business community here in the U.S. as well as in China. American businessmen really wanted to do business in China. I was on a part of a seminar. It was stunning to me. These are financial service companies, Americans, big names, all names you know of, over and over again, on how much they want to invest in China. Talked about investment caps. Talked about the auditing difference between our two countries. It's really important. And I might add this point too. You know, Liu He and Mnuchin have done a good job working together on trade and financial service issues between our two countries. It's kind of, it's below the radar, but it's important. They keep talking, they keep working. And I think there's a real role here for financial service companies to build on that relationship that's existing now between U.S. and China. And and that's the kind of thing which I'm quite certain that a Biden administration will want to pursue.
Michael, do you agree with that? What do you think it means for the business community?
I think that I generally do agree with that. I think that there is an interest from the U.S. on protecting the supply chains from China, and so much of U.S. economic development has been fueled by our reliance also on a Chinese partner and access to the Chinese markets. I think that we have seen what we've seen over the last few years, as Mr. Bacchus said, were a series of tariffs that were imposed that upended sort of the traditional approach to trade policy and trade protectionism that generally prevails in a U.S. administration. It usually operates with anti-dumping and countervailing duties investigations and matters. Here, what you had was a series of tariffs really seemed to recede as a strategy, and tariffs came to the fore. And so what you had were literally thousands and thousands of companies looking for individual exclusions to specific tariffs that were imposed by the Commerce Department. Right. And it made for unpredictable and difficult, and frankly, difficult business decisions for U.S. companies. We represented literally dozens of companies that sought tariff exclusions, and often companies that were similarly situated, who were making essentially the same widget. And one company would get an exclusion and one company wouldn't. And there was no rhyme nor reason to it. And so it made things very difficult, and it increased the costs on American businesses. Now, again, I don't think that President Biden is going to immediately reverse the tariff policy. I just think that as both Brian and Mr. Bacchus have described, it's politically very difficult, even if it's a sound idea. So what I think, though, but I do think that we are not going to see additional tariffs imposed. I don't think you're going to see a strategy to keep your foot on the gas, to keep penalizing in the same way. Now, that doesn't mean I think that the U.S. government is going to somehow suddenly go soft on China. I think that there has been a lot of groundwork prepared. I think that there is a consensus, as I mentioned earlier, around the country that we need to take a more aggressive form. We need to engage in a more aggressive way. But I think that the strategies will ultimately be a little different. I think that if we're going to pursue trade remedies, it's going to be through the more traditional approach of trade remedies. If they're going to impose sanctions, it's going to be for specific acts, not for perceived acts or perceived concerns, as we saw with the executive orders this fall for TikTok and WeChat. I think that I just think that we're more likely to see a more calibrated, slower, and more cautious approach to some of these decisions, and in some cases, perhaps more data-driven as well.
So, I mean, it seems as I think most people would agree that what you're somewhat alluding to, I think, is also the Made in China 2025 plan, the Wolf Warrior diplomacy. Those were sort of two significant turns in the U.S. China relationship. I mean, given what's happened, do you think that so you won't see these broad strokes, I think. You're going to see, are there still going to be pinpointed opportunities then for Chinese companies in the U.S.?
For sure. Peter, I think that it's a great question. I should have mentioned this. And, when you asked earlier about the trade war, and I think that this has been somewhat bigger than a trade war. It's also been a tech war. And a lot of the U.S. policy decisions have been made to try to slow progress of Chinese companies that had started to perhaps surpass U.S. companies in certain fields, whether it was 5G, video surveillance, or others. And so what did the U.S. government do? It tried to place hurdles in front of the global development of some of these companies. And it was all done oftentimes in the name of national security. And so I think that we have to be mindful that this isn't just about a trade imbalance. It is ultimately about what the future is going to look like and who's going to have the most influence in the development of critical technologies. And the U.S. government has used its power and has used its global influence to try, perhaps a little late, but to try to slow some of the development and the advancements that the Chinese have made. And I do think we're going to continue to see that.
So Brian, China is boosting foreign access to huge onshore capital and consumer markets. I mean, there are certainly enormous opportunities when you look at it that way. Is that going to be enough, do you think, to encourage more pro-China opinions from the business community? Many people have sort of stepped back. Certainly American companies have stepped back, I think, in the public eye in terms of promoting a pro-China engagement agenda. But we still cannot deny it has the second largest or largest economy, depending on the metrics you use, in the world. And American businesses want access to that. New York states, exporters, they want access to that. How do you see that playing out? Is it going to be enough to change some of the winds here, if you will?
Listen, I think if you're a Chinese tech company, you're going to have challenges. That's just the reality of where we are today. But I think other companies can make their strong case. I mean, the ambassador is right. China has earned the right to be here. They've created their own manufacturing base. Some would say at our expense and that we let them do it, but they still created it for themselves. I think what President Trump did more than anything else, and you see it now in the tone difference, is he's changed the lens on how Americans and policymakers see China. Before, during the Bush era, the Clinton-Bush era, is like, they saw them as the huge economic opportunity. During the Obama era, we saw them as somebody who was purchasing our debt and yet really couldn't criticize the bad things that was going on. I think Trump, put a new lens on, and he sort of opened everybody's eyes, if that's the language we're going to use, to see that China was not playing by the rules. They're not honoring their agreements. They're taking advantage of all these situations. He sort of changed that lens, and that's how they see things now, the policymakers. There's no one ringing that bell anymore. More and more policymakers that come in are going to be sharing that same point of view. But I think if you're a tech company, you expect to be treated differently, Chinese tech company. I think if there's other companies, we welcome that investment. We welcome that engagement. It's good overall for both of our economies. They're integrated. They're too integrated to fail at this point. But I think there are going to be, I think the tech is just going to be a tremendously difficult space. And that's where the Chinese growth is. I mean, they are leading the world in AI. And that ultimately becomes, that's sort of, the charge for what the next generation is going to look like. So, I think China has some challenges as it tries to integrate and continue to work with American business with respect to tech. But I think other companies will be, other sectors will be a little bit easier.
Ambassador, where do you stand on this? I mean, you've lived in China, you know China very well. You've seen the size of the market. You've seen how U.S. companies have interacted there. You've seen how Chinese companies come here. Is it going to be enough to sway some opinion, given again some of the backdrop of what you stated, that the Biden administration will continue to stay tough on China, but you did see an enormous outpouring of chambers of commerce, including CGCC, American Chamber of Commerce, U.S. China Business Council, lobbying the U.S. government not to be as hard on China. And at the end of the day, you've got companies that have a specific interest, consumers that have an interest, and even, I would argue, policymakers or politicians where, you know, in real estate, it's all about location, location, location. In politics, it's about jobs, 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 or at least that's a big part of it. So how do you see that playing out?
Well, this is too many thousand feet above our current discussion, but when I was over there, I saw a big change after the Snowden revelations. I just dropped you. Something happened to my screen. Shoot.
We still have you.
We'll see you, Senator or Ambassador.
Okay, well, I can't see any of you. That's okay. I can just keep talking. Anyway, after the Snowden revelations, you could see a big change in Chinese attitude toward their own companies and technologies. What I'm saying is, they started passing lots of statutes under the guise of protecting Chinese national security. But really, it was not just that, it was also protecting their own companies. They had quite a strong protectionist tinge. And it was under the guise of national security. Now, of course, self-preservation is the strongest human instinct. National security is probably number one for any country. But it just made it difficult to have a rational discussion with the Chinese and American companies that come to China, because Chinese would say, well, national security, national security. Same thing has happened in the U.S. Where national security is such a big umbrella. It's so important. It's being used to some degree to protect American companies. And we have to, as both countries in the world, find some way to kind of penetrate that bubble, that national security bubble. It's important. I don't want to diminish it at all, but we've got to figure out a way that we can start working and trading and maybe ring fence national security issues, or start developing technologies where we can find out what degree of Huawei is actually spying and not spying, for example. But it's become a big problem, national security. The American companies I deal with in China tell me that the Chinese government is going overboard to try to encourage more investment to help them in China as part of their economic development. It's stunning how much I run across this. Now, it's true.
Financial markets have opened, correct?
Financial markets are a lot more open now than they were a few years ago.
Yep.
No question about it. Equity caps on financial companies have been eliminated, and they've been, or at least significantly alleviated. So that is a big plus. And I think it's, American companies, financial companies, think that they've got more sophistication and kind of help the Chinese financial companies be more efficient. And there's probably some truth to it, but it has to be done in a way where the Chinese companies don't feel threatened. A big opportunity here is pensions, pension funds. I mean, the demographics in China are about as bad as they are in the U.S. with the aging population, and there's opportunity for major American and other countries financial companies to help develop pension financing in China. It gives Chinese elderly a little more security. So there are a lot of opportunities here. And I tend to think we get too wrapped around the axle, look at the headlines, the political headlines, and forget that, business is business. A lot of businessmen can do deals irrespective of what's going on in the newspapers.
But on that point, Ambassador, and I'm gonna start with Brian on this one. And I think you've all sort of alluded to this, and the ambassador certainly in his last statement just now. There's a public image problem for China in the United States, and that was certainly exacerbated by COVID-19. You certainly had an enormous amount of rhetoric, even coming out of the White House, constantly calling it the China virus. But the rhetoric and the xenophobia has really ramped itself up. Even violence against Asians, didn't matter if they were Chinese or non-Chinese. There's an image problem here, and we have a lot of CGCC members on the line right now, and they're wondering, what is it that they can do? There's certain issues. Again, it's quite broad here right now. So you've got issues in terms of legislation. What can they do legally? What could they do politically? But let's first, before we get to that, let's just the public eye, in the eyes of government and media, and just their general standing in the local community. Brian, how would you advise Chinese companies now in the U.S. To look at these things and to operate?
They got to communities. They've got to have their voices heard. I mean, that's the ultimate pushback. What we've learned over the years, and the senator, ambassador can tell you, is politicians are responsive to their constituency. And if their constituency is making noise in their communities and their neighborhoods, politicians are going to listen. This is a deeply personal issue for me. I mean, I have an Asian son. And so I see how the tone of the president over the last 4 years is going to affect him. And it's going to be a couple of years before, we get things right again with how Asian Americans are treated here by some, Americans. But I think, what I advise everybody is you got to lean in. I mean, I look at the media and this space is sort of a great white shark. It's going to eat. You better feed it or it's going to eat you. And so you have to lean in with, whether you organize the businesses, whether you organize the communities differently, whether you make that contact at the congressional, the senatorial level, you've got to be filling that space if you're a Chinese. Others will, and this is the shark that needs to feed. And like I tell clients all the time in DC, unless you're feeding the shark, it's eating you. That's just the reality of how DC, at least for some of the things I work for, work out. And so, I think, if you're in your communities, if you're a business leader in your community, if you're a politician in your community, you got to lean in the engagement. You can't let that space be filled by the anger and the frustration or, even the hate. Because once you let that set in, it'll even take years for that to reverse. So I think at this critical time, I lean in because of, who my family is and how we're involved and how it affects my son and how it affects my community. But I encourage everybody to lean in at this level because, there are some good things that President Trump did, but these are the negative effects of some of those actions as well that President Trump did.
Michael, you're in DC. You're seeing it as close as we all are, or closer, if you will. What should Chinese companies be doing to combat this level of xenophobia and public image issues and media issues? What do you see? What are companies, in fact, your clients, trying to do?
I think it is a business imperative for Chinese companies to try to engage with U.S. decision makers. I think it's difficult to worry about. I think it's less important to worry about a media narrative, but it's far more important to work through the actual business of business. As Mr. Bacchus said, you could get really wrapped around the axle of following these headlines and following the daily high-level politics. But the reality is the transactions in business are going to continue to occur. And there are going to be a lot of decisions that the U.S. government is going to make or that other governments are going to make that fall sort of somewhere far below the headlines. And as we discussed over, for example, the next 11 weeks where I said that I think that there is a real risk to a number of Chinese companies that the US administration could take unilateral punitive steps against them and targeting them. I think there are two things that need to be done. You can evaluate whether or not constructive engagement and interactions with these agencies is going to be helpful. And I think in this environment, it is potentially marginally beneficial. But I think what is absolutely critical is understanding what they're doing and trying to gather information, try to understand what potentially could come, so that your headquarters and so your business operations teams can actually plan for every potential eventuality. If you're not thinking about, if you're thinking only about business options and not about potential political options, regulatory options, and regulatory consequences and political consequences, you're really missing, it's an incomplete view of risk management. And I think it's very risky, because if you're a Chinese company that and you haven't been paying attention, and suddenly the US government adds you to the entity list and makes it impossible to export US components that are critical to the technology that you manufacture, whatever, or if the US government imposes Magnitsky Act sanctions on you for human rights related issues, or if the US government chooses to, under the guise of sort of national security, limit your business operations here, you want to be able to have contingency plans. You want to be able to think through corporate structures. You want to think through, you want to at least be ready to anticipate what you can. And so I think that it's really critical to invest the time in and the energy into understanding what actually is happening in Washington, because the consequences for not paying attention can be really severe.
So, yeah, go ahead, Ambassador.
You know, I just, you know, this is kind of corny, but you know, I've run in 18 different elections. I've faced voters in Montana 18 different times, primary and general elections. And a lot of times people would praise me. A lot of times people would give me an earful, just give me the tickets, just how much they're upset with me. And I keep reminding them, I know it's easier in my home state of Montana than it might be in other states. You know, you're the employers. We're just employees. We members of the Senate and the House. We're just hired hands. You as employers got to act like employers. And whether you're Chinese American or you're not a Chinese American, you're still our employers. And so you have to engage with your congressional delegation, your senators. I know it's a bit more difficult in more populous states, but if you don't try, nothing's going to happen. And I've seen senators turned around because of mail or telephone calls from home. Don't forget, everybody in the House and the Senate wants to get reelected. And how do you get reelected? You get reelected by doing what you think the people back home want. And if people back home want A, well, that's probably what that Senator or House member is going to look at. They're also busy. They're incredibly busy. Most items are in the back burner for them. So you got to figure out some way to put an item on the front burner. And that's just by getting organized. Now, I know it sounds corny. It really sounds corny, but I believe it strongly that if anybody, let's say a Chinese American, were to pick up a telephone or figure out some way or organize some way constructively, not antagonistically, but constructively about some issue that they think maybe their member just doesn't quite fully understand, it'd go a long way. It'd go a long, long way. So I just urge everybody to as has been said, know what's going on. But your leverage, frankly, is often in your own states with your own senators and your own House members.
It seems like you're advocating, and I don't disagree with it, that it doesn't matter if it's a legal issue, if it's a political issue, if it's a financial issue, regulatory issue. The Chinese companies operating here, in order to expand their operations, in order to enhance cooperation, given the backdrop of where we are today, should be taking a much more aggressive approach. We're saying in the past they took a more passive approach, if you will, and just try to get whatever business that they can get done. But it seems like we really need to see the Chinese companies operating in a much more, you know, I won't get into sort of the lobbying issues and rules and regulations around that, but still, they need to have a seat at the table. They need to knock on doors. They need to be, we've seen it with WeChat and TikTok, where they didn't let it rest, the executive actions, and they went into court and they did get a restraining order on the executive actions in place. Is that that didn't work out as well in the Huawei situation, but I think Brian might say, and I think we all know maybe telecommunications is slightly more sensitive and more difficult. But what do you say to that approach, Ambassador? And then we'll go.
I agree. I mean, be more aggressive, but you got to pick your shots. Sometimes it's litigation. Sometimes it's not litigation. Sometimes it's just a sort of a public relations effort. Sometimes it's just individually going to a community and talking to people and trying to joint venture with somebody else. But it depends. But it is important, clearly, to be more aggressive. There's no question about that.
Brian?
Yeah, no, listen, I'm all for, I mean, I'll use the word, you're afraid to do it. I'm not. You got to lobby. You got to talk to policymakers. You got to have an impact. I mean, the ambassador just said it right. You know, constituents matter. I mean, I started in a government, in a district office where I dealt with constituents. Every day that elected official called me and said, who were the constituents that called and what did they need? And I think, you know, if you can organize that, you can organize your businesses, you know, these American Chinese businesses, you're going to have an impact. I mean, it's, I've seen it time after time. You know, I've been involved in campaigns where you've organized, you know, diaspora in certain communities, and they have an impact. I mean, it's clearly, you know, if you're going to take it to the local level, that's where you're going to have the fastest touch, because that's where the most responsive, because that's, you know, that's how they measure whether they're coming back or not, and they all want to be here.
Well, I also add something else. I hate to say this, but it's money.
Yep.
Find some major contributors that have your same point of view and can talk to that senator, that congressperson. It's, you know, they take telephone calls from their big Chinese American, or somebody says, hey, you know, hey, Mr. Senator, hey, Congress, what about this? You know, what they'll listen. And also, it's important. It's extremely important. Follow up, not just one encounter. And all the things we've been talking about. It's follow up. It's consistency. Add to that, it's specificity, not some big abstract concept. Abstraction's cruelty. Rather, it's got to be something more specific, follow up, done constructively with the point of view to helping find common cause.
Michael, is a strategy here similar to really what American companies had to do in China for so many years, to maybe switch their strategy to more of a joint venture cooperation structure, if you will, to sort of ease some of the tensions in some of these investments? We saw it now recently with TikTok and Oracle, but there's been other cases where some Chinese companies want to go all in by themselves, but I've seen a few where they will take on a joint venture partner, and then the local government or even federal government may look differently upon that type of investments, even though there's still scrutiny, especially out in California on the West Coast and some of these minority tech investments. There still seems to be a certain level of scrutiny over specific technologies. But is that the change of approach possibly, that how Chinese companies can do better here, or should be looking at things?
I don't think I don't think there's a secret sauce. I don't think that there's something, and I'm not certain that the joint venture approach would necessarily work universally. Even we saw with TikTok and Oracle, it was a bumpy process, and it's unclear how well it's ultimately going to work. one thing that I just want to remark on the last question, because we discussed litigation as a strategy, and far be it from the lawyer at a law firm to say, when you get to litigation, you're in bad shape. You don't want to have to get to litigation. And so you want to be able to do everything you can before that point to get to litigation. And as both of the others have said, it's about affirmative engagement that's specific and meaningful. And it's about persistence and consistently communicating. I was a Hill staffer for a long time. And I would, one of the dirty secrets that often lobbyists will sell to potential clients is that I can give you access with this staffer or this member of Congress or senator. It's ridiculous. It's not that. It's really, access is not that hard. If you have, if you have a facility in a community, if you're a large business, people are going to want to hear what your perspective is. They're going to want to hear what you have to say. And I can't think of any, candidly, meeting that I did not take when I was a staffer on the Hill in almost 10 years. If someone wanted to meet with me, and I was the senior counsel for the House Financial Services Committee during the financial crisis, Dodd-Frank, and after. And I was during crazy times. And there was never a time when there was someone I wouldn't meet with. And frankly, when people would come in and see me with specific agendas, not high-level talking points, but when they had a very clear request, I believed it was my job to help try to solve the problem. If there was a problem, go to do what we can to fix it. And I think that that's really, it's an important component of the strategy, is not just to think that, hey, I got a meeting, but it's what you say in that meeting that really matters. And so a carefully calibrated argument that is backed up by facts and data can have a really substantial positive effect. And in terms of developing a corporate structure, though, to try to mitigate U.S. scrutiny, I don't think that that's going to be sufficient, because the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, a group of administration, cabinet level officials chaired by the Treasury Department, exists to scrutinize investments by foreign companies. I'm sorry?
But CFIUS was expanded with the FIRMA regulations. So it seems, there's somewhat of a deterrent impact, a deterrent effect there. But I think you also have American companies that may be skittish now on going through that process, which, so it's a deterrent both for Chinese companies and for American companies. But is there any resolve there to kind of, are you seeing much resolve there to go through that, regardless of the industry, especially now that FIRMA has expanded its scope?
This process is not easy, but it's also been designed. It's not designed to block transactions, reflexively. It's to block transactions where there is a risk to the United States. And there are certain segments and certain sectors where you're going to find that you're going to come under more scrutiny. And you can look through, if you look through the last 15 years, you can see at different periods where CFIUS has been more aggressive towards certain transactions. It was in 2006, the scrutiny of the Dubai Ports World attempted acquisition of U.S. ports and U.S. seaports in Long Beach and others. And this was, just 5 years after 9/11. The idea that a Middle Eastern state-owned enterprise was going to potentially acquire the U.S. ports seemed like a real national security risk. And even though CFIUS approved it, Congress stepped in and ultimately pushed the blockage. You've seen it also with on food production. You've seen it on technology. You've seen it in the financial markets, and where CFIUS scrutiny has been challenging, but it's not necessarily disqualifying.
So, Ambassador, then let's go on a sector basis. And I'm going to take this question actually from, we're sort of on our hour of discussion. We want to leave the last. I've got a whole host of other questions which I may use, but I do want to, respect the audience this time in trying to answer as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So I'm gonna segue into this question from one of our audience members. So the Chinese business community have interest in the U.S. and vice versa. President-elect Biden has already indicated that he plans on rejoining the Paris Accord. And certainly what we saw during the Obama administration is a big push on green energy, and we expect probably the same for a Biden administration. And at the same time, there's been a lot of campaigning around a potential infrastructure bill as well. So taking green energy, Paris Accord, and infrastructure, our audience member asks, are these possible areas of cooperation for the two governments to really seek common ground, and Chinese companies should pursue those specific areas from the outset?
Yes, clearly it's common ground there. As my hope is we go back to the agreement between President Xi and President Obama. When I was serving in Beijing, I started talking to President Xi about climate and other members of the Chinese government about climate change. It was like talking to a fence post. I got nowhere, nothing. Then after a while, you see a little bit of glimmer of interest. Now, not just myself, but Obama came over a couple of times to talk about climate, as did Secretary John Kerry, Secretary of State, and Prince Kurt Commerce. But then pretty soon you'd see the Chinese get more engaged in it. And then they started leading the charge. Why? Because it's an opportunity for their president, President Xi, to be on the stage with American president. Second, is an opportunity for the leadership, to a large degree, wants to do the right thing, to push back on the troglodytes, that is the non-reformers in China, saying to them, hey, we got to do this, we got to reform a bit so we can be on the world stage. And also a huge opportunity for China to invest in renewable energy technologies, solar, wind, and they did it with a vengeance, so much so that it's going to deluge American industries. So they see an opportunity directly and peripherally to address climate. And clearly the United States wants to, Biden does too, that's his inclination. As you said, Paris Accord, that's not perfect, but heck, let's work with it. Let's work with the Paris Accord rather than not. And also it's an opportunity because 28% Chinese, they're by far the world's largest emitter. We're next, we Americans, we're about 13%, and then India and Indonesia will fall off after that. So I do think that climate is becoming more and more of an issue in the United States and in the world. People start trying to figure out some way to deal with it, but fairly, because clearly if we address climate and China doesn't, well, it doesn't make much difference. We're still going to have a lot of carbon emissions. And so I think there is an opportunity. It's not going to be right away, but that is an avenue that I think create some potential for our two countries.
And infrastructure, because there was a lot of pushback by this administration in terms of buses or rail cars being manufactured by the Chinese.
No. I think if Biden had his way, he'd go strongly in all of that. But we're a big country. There are a lot of different interests in our country. As mentioned, this could be Republican Senate. Republican Senate might have a little bit different point of view on some of the Republican senators might have a different point of view on that subject. So it's, I just, it sounds a little naive. I just hope that there's a little more good faith all the way around because, a lot of these infrastructure measures, including climate, should not be partisan. It's for America. And we should give credit both sides, not just try to take credit one side. And if we can give credit both sides, work together, I think there's a good chance that you'll see a significant infrastructure bill. But A lot of that depends on other factors too. COVID. America, to be honest, most Americans today don't care very much about China. They really don't. What they really care about right now is COVID. They care about job loss. And that's number one, that's number two in America today. So Biden's going to address COVID, and he's going to try to do something about jobs, that's infrastructure. And then down the road, he'll start to think more about China. And I'm hopeful that by then it's going to be constructive. Not roll over play dead, but constructive.
So that
Peter, can I add one thought, Peter?
Yeah, sure, Michael.
So, energy policy, though, also extends beyond just, questions about climate. And I think that there's something important to keep in mind, which was, for example, the Department of Energy in response, so the president in May signed an executive order about securing the U.S. bulk power system, and the executive order declared threats to the bulk power system by foreign adversaries constitute a national emergency. And the executive order that's being implemented by the Department of Energy prohibits the acquisition, importation, transfer, installation of bulk power system electric equipment that has a nexus with any foreign adversary. This is the concern that somehow we're going to be turning over the power grid to China if you allow Chinese companies to supply equipment to U.S. energy producers. And so this remains, this goes sort of the heart of a lot of the things that we've been discussing this hour, which are, there are still going to be business restrictions. And this is sort of below the daily headline about whether the U.S. is in the Paris Climate Agreement, whether the U.S. and China are going to coordinate on and the rest of the world on emissions or other measures to impact climate change. But here is the nuts and bolts of how the U.S. government is treating Chinese businesses in the United States. It is with suspicion, and it is with so there are additional hurdles that the Chinese are going to face in every critical industry. And here's just in the energy space, here is another one.
So I'm glad you approached or answered the energy question, because we did get that question from the audience. I haven't gotten to, but it still leads me then to another question. And it's sort of a hybrid between what one of the audience members has asked and what I had planned as well, and Brian, I'm going to let you approach this. And the ambassador somewhat alluded to it, but where is the balance then between the national security interests, or how do we balance the national security interests, the common economic interests, the current, as the ambassador stated, now we're in a present and post. And then if you throw in on top of that, the Democrats still have to get elected or want to get elected in 2022 or 2024, where they can't be viewed as soft on China. And so how do all four of those interests, if you will, and that's why people pay you the big bucks, I know, really balance out over this transit over the next 4 years?
Yeah, listen, it's going to be tough. It's going to be a significant amount of engagement that needs to take place. It's going to vary from sector to sector, obviously. But at the end of the day, Michael is right. I mean, the day-to-day business transactions will go on. There's probably going to be, additional scrutiny that's unfair, unfounded, and then policymakers will ultimately have to fix those things and how they see fit. I think, the community needs to step up and say we need to be treated equally, just like everybody else. I think that's always been the struggle that communities have after these things. I think we remember after September 11th, the Muslim community came forward and said, hey, we're not all behaving this way, and they worked to dispel those things. But listen, the challenges are layered. The challenges vary from political parties, and they vary within political parties. There is I was just having a conversation with a congressman today who's on the Foreign Affairs Committee who doesn't agree with the Rubio process of engaging China. He points to the fact that philosophy has failed with Cuba. So why should we expect it to be any different with China? which is the non-engagement. So, I mean, listen, there's divisions within political parties, there's divisions within the parties, but I think, the ultimate, some gain we have from this is, sitting back and saying it doesn't affect me or it's not going to touch me is no longer the response that Chinese companies are afforded. It touches you, tangentially, it touches you organically now, and we're seeing it more and more touch you regulatory-wise. I mean, that's just going to be the day-to-day challenges for Chinese companies in the U.S. going forward for a very long time. And then let me throw the wrench in here, which we haven't talked about, which is the gorilla in the roof, or the gorilla in the room. If President Trump decides to run again, what do you think he's going to be hitting Joe Biden on? China. And he's going to do that for 4 years. I mean, he's going to make the decision in the next 30 days that he's going to run again. And he's not going to allow Joe Biden to have a honeymoon.
Are you predicting that?
Yes.
You're predicting a 2024, if he loses, if it gets certified, you're predicting a 2024 run?
Yes.
I think we've had big news for today.
Buckle up.
Buckle up. But let me continue with that. So the phase one deal, Ambassador, was a big priority during the last year. It certainly hit some headwinds, if you will, in terms of COVID. Do you think are we going to see a phase two as a priority at all in the next administration?
Might take a little while. It's not going to be immediate.
I'm sorry?
It might take a while.
Oh, okay.
It will not be immediate. Let me back up on something that I find somewhat encouraging. I don't want to put too much stake in it, but since the probable election of Joe Biden, my cell phone has been inundated with messages from Chinese friends, WeChat and messages and texts and under the sun, are very happy that Biden seems to be the new president. Why is that? It's not because they think Biden's going to be a pushover. That's not it at all. Rather, they feel in China, these are Chinese in China, somewhat empowered that an American who respects democracy and has high ideals, who is really a bit of the beacon on the hill and respects due process, got elected. As democracy prevailed, you'd be amazed. There's one fellow very high up in the Chinese government who constantly emails me, WeChats me about this and what's going on. He's so happy that that Biden got elected. That's also because they think a Biden election will help strengthen the hands of reformers in China, not the troglodytes. I mean, not the hawks, but the reformers. And there's a big battle going on in China between the hawks and reformers. We don't see very much of it, but it's there. And it's if I'm not saying this is the case, but if it's true that a Biden election tends to good, that's going to help President Xi Jinping be a little more accommodating toward the United States. He's got to listen to the hawks. He's got to listen to the reformers. He's got to listen to different voices on the Politburo and the Standing Committee, for example. So if it's true, what my Chinese friends are telling me, and I'm not being self-selected, I hope I'm not being selective, then I think there's a little bit of hope.
Mike, I'll ask you for your take on that, but I really want to ask you, what you're seeing in DC, are you seeing any other, I think one article that I saw, there were roughly 300 proposals of legislation in sort of the decoupling world. Not many of those have passed, but there's still proposals that are out there. Are you seeing anything else that's coming down the pipeline in terms of restricting or preventing cooperation between Chinese and American companies or with Chinese companies operating here in the U.S.?
So there's one more legislative vehicle before the year is out of any consequence, and that's the National Defense Authorization Act. And at the moment, neither the House nor the Senate passed versions include any particularly punitive steps. This bill, though, is the bill that's passed every year for the last 60 years to fund the U.S. military. It's the only measure that Congress passes every year and has done without fail for the last 60 years. And so it will pass again sometime probably around Thanksgiving or between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And it is likely to include some sort of policy prescriptions that could be that could target China. It is, we've seen, I think the one that is most likely is a version of the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. This is a law or a bill that would require the deregistration of companies off of U.S. securities exchanges if the SEC and the PCAOB, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, doesn't have access to a company's full accounting records, complete records, to conduct a complete audit for 3 consecutive years. This was a measure that passed the Senate by unanimous consent. No one, which means no one objected when it was raised by Senator Kennedy. The same day as it passed the Senate, the chairman of the relevant subcommittee in the House introduced an identical bill. Now, the version that the House's version is slightly different now than the Senate version. And one is included in the House version is included in its NDAA, the Senate version is not. And I think that bill, the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, is the one that's most likely to be included in anything that passes in the NDAA. I think that other measures are less likely to pass because I just don't think that a Democratic House is going to want to tie future President Biden's hands before he has his defense team in place. And I think what they'd probably seek to do is to punt for a year and wait and allow Joe Biden and his team to have a say in whatever policies are going to be enacted. So I think that there's that one issue to be really cautious of, or is most likely legislatively the one to be worried about over the next month or so. A secondary one, as I mentioned, is providing some sort of framework around the Department of Defense list of Chinese communist military companies and affiliated companies. Those, I think, that would be a second issue, I think, to closely monitor. And then, of course, there are all of the potential executive actions that we discussed at the beginning of the call or this webinar, where the president could take unilateral steps targeting the Chinese.
Yeah, Brian, that's a good final question there for you. Are you seeing anything in DC down the pipeline, or do you suspect there will be some more executive action taken by the president to tie the hands of the next administration, if it's a Biden administration?
I do hear conversations of that, how far along or how cooked they are. I think that's a different story. Like I said, I had conversations with friends at DOD today where they talked about getting directives that more sanctions should be launching. I think left to the president politically, because that's how he views this more than anything else, he probably would do more sanctions. That's just his instinctive nature. That's just his unpredictable nature too. But I wouldn't be surprised. It just I couldn't narrow it to who it would be right now. But knowing these guys, knowing the apparatus, having worked with them for the past couple of years, even some of the career folks at Treasury and Commerce and DOD, they're sort of we're anticipating something.
So we've got 10 minutes left before the close of this, and I've got a few final comments that I have to make prior to the end. I think I really want to close based on the theme for today, and I'm just going to throw this question out there, maybe keep it brief. If you are advising the next administration, and again, suppose it is a Biden administration, as it looks to be today. What are going to be your one or two first pieces of advice that you would give? What's your priority in terms of the U.S. China relationship that, again, takes into consideration not just American companies operating in China, but really also, especially for our members here, Chinese companies operating in the United States. Why don't we start with Michael, and we'll go to Brian, and then we'll close on the ambassador, with the ambassador.
So it's a really interesting question, and one that I haven't thought about. So this will be sort of
I'm doing this one. I'm doing this on the cuff, of course.
A very off the cuff response.
Off the cuff.
But I think it would be to base your policy decisions on facts and reality, and not fears and sensationalism. And I think that it's completely appropriate, and we're Americans. Protecting U.S. national security for every American is our #1 priority, as was said earlier. And so, if you're going to make decisions in the interest of national security, I hope that it truly does advance our national security in a meaningful way. And I hope that the decisions that President Biden will make will be based on facts and based on reality, and not on fears and suspicions.
Brian?
Yeah, listen, I think, what I advise people how to navigate this is help understand how, Washington has looked at Chinese companies in the last 4 years, and knowing that it's not going to sort of change overnight. And the statement that I always heard from Trump administration officials, whether they're career or political appointees, is they always view China in the lens of, like, you have to view them as, we're always waiting for the smoking gun. Chinese is a different situation. Why would we hand them a loaded weapon? And I think that's the mentality you're dealing with in Washington, D.C. I think businesses can be successful, but you got to mitigate those risks and concerns. So you have to get in there early. But I do think that there's going to be tremendous opportunities there. I think the Biden administration, they're going to be restructuring our economy post-COVID. I'm pretty sure he's going to have China involved in it somehow. It's hard to ignore because of how large the economy is there in China. But I think, engage early, mitigate the risks, identify the risks and mitigate the risks is probably going to be the fastest way for you guys for anybody to move the ball in DC during the Biden administration. Because I just do think they're going to be somewhat risk adverse because they're going to continue to have, Trump, sort of, shadow government in everybody's ear.
Okay. And Ambassador, you're probably one of the closest to the Vice President, our President-elect. What's your priority and your advice going to be for him on day one?
Well, I'm just speaking personally, not what I'm talking to him about. I think it would make quite a difference if he were to name, if the next U.S. ambassador to China is someone with tremendous gravitas, somebody who is an adult in the room, somebody who the United States is showing to China, hey, we respect you, but also someone who's not going to get pushed around. So someone that China respects very much too. That sent a very positive signal.
My father would be saying right now, are you nominating me? But
I'm sure we are.
that's my father, if you will. But no, I agree with you. I think what I've seen in recent years, is that there really are not enough even China experts, people who really know China.
I agree with that. That's so true. That is so true. I'm not going to name names, but it's embarrassing how little American policy people know about China. It's embarrassing.
I agree with that. I think there really needs to be somebody in the room who has that level of experience and can really speak to it, whether they've lived in China or worked with China for many years. You certainly have, and the others on this call have, but you need to have that level of exposure and experience, and even the relationships to really be able to understand the culture, the politics, the economics, and the environment. And organizations like CGCC certainly play a role in that. And so with that, I really do want to thank you all for a great conversation, for sharing your insights and experiences with the group. I'm sure it is giving a lot of new perspective to many of us on the call. It was useful and it was beneficial to the board members, and it really serves as a good reference point for many of them that are planning their 2021, 2022 plans and operations here in the U.S. And we know that if they want to follow up with any of you individually, you would certainly welcome calls from all of our members.